for me, I write, as you suggested, because it's a way to expand my work beyond hospital walls, right? Because it's a way to reach out directly to policymakers, reach out directly to patients, and inform and convince and describe in a way that feels very hard to do if I was to sit in my clinic 5 days a week and do nothing but see patients.
This is Real Perspective, and I'm your host, Eli Yetter-Bowman. On this show, I interview various professional storytellers, often in the documentary space like myself, and we explore the craft of storytelling. Guests share their honest perspectives, from past mistakes to tips for succeeding and other genuine insights on how we can make a living creatively. This show includes no advertisers to keep things more authentic. If you want to support us, help us out, we do offer a variety of consulting services for filmmakers, storytellers, businesses, and other groups, on top of producing documentaries. Shoot us a message at etherealfilms.org if you want to learn more. And now, it's time for the show. Today's guest is Simar, a soon-to-be medical student who writes articles to share the narrative behind medical and scientific stories. We also met as colleagues in our cohort for Excellent Science Communicators, and today we chat about his pivot into writing as a student and how that work is aimed at transforming academic articles into full-fledged stories. Without further ado, Simar, do you want to give a little self-introduction really quick?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. My name is Simar Bajaj. I currently study epidemiology at the University of Oxford. But really, I think of myself as a writer. I've written for medical journals, I've written for newspapers, I've written for magazines, and I'm a big believer in sort of the power of words, not only to inform, but also shift policy making and influence policy making. So for me, I'm a science writer. I primarily write about health and medicine, and it just gives me a lot of joy. I mean, it's even when I was doing research articles, I would be doing it for the writing rather than particularly because I was terribly interested in the hypothesis-driven methods or whatnot. So yeah, I mean, I think that's how I think of myself as a writer. I'm going to be going to medical school down the road and hope to ultimately become a physician writer in the mold of physicians like Atul Gawande or Henry Marsh.
There's a lot of directions that I want to go with this, just because I think there's a lot of value to the medical industry, particularly in the United States, when it comes to incorporating story and really engaging more of a discussion around like the state of things. Like, I'm very interested in that. I want to put that on pause for a second. We'll come back to it because I want you to tell me the story that you wrote about this trauma surgeon in Baltimore. I know you're a writer, but now I'm forcing you to tell me the story in your own words.
For sure. I mean, it started off, as many stories do, with a recommendation. One of my sources mentioned that, someone you should really talk to is one of my friends from graduate school. He's a trauma surgeon in Baltimore, and he's working on gun violence, and he was shot himself at age 17 in the neck. And there's something quite compelling to be in there. The fact that someone who has been traumatized by a bullet, who has made it his life's work to take care of other people in that same position. I mean, you don't see, there are plenty of gun violence victims and survivors in this country. You don't see many of them going to become trauma surgeons and really leading the advocacy on this as well. I mean, that was another aspect of his story that stood out to me, that he is not someone that was stopping in the clinic. He was continuing it outside, working with the city of Baltimore, working with Maryland State, working with a U.S. Congress, testifying and shaping legislation. For me, it stood out for a couple of reasons. One is that the unique aspect of the story, but also in part because the role of a physician has been challenged over the years. Physicians used to be a lot more conservative. There used to be this real sense that you have to stay in your lane, that physicians know how to treat patients, they should just stay and do that. But medicine, of course, intersects with so many different dimensions of society. And I think gun violence is a very clear aspect of that, because who is seeing the worst aspects of gun violence day by day? Many times it's the doctors who are caring for these patients, trying to piece their bodies literally back together. So for me, I think it was, I found out about this guy figure that, and this is my first profile, I want to do it on him than anyone else. And went down to Baltimore and Johns Hopkins and spent 24 hours on trauma call with him. It was essentially supposed to be 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. We went a little bit long because motor vehicle accident came in and the person had broken his leg, and so we stayed until 9:30 a.m. And I think my favorite anecdote from this whole trip was that, I mean, we've just been awake for basically 24 hours, maybe like a small nap in between. I am going back to my hotel to sleep because I'm exhausted and I've just been like up for essentially 24 hours. He is driving an hour or two to Fairfax because his little niece is having a dance recital. So it's one of those things where I think for me, it's such a compelling character, someone who cares, but also someone that exemplifies a growing model of the physician. And certainly a controversial one too, that there's still that sensation that you have to stay in your lane.
In reviewing the story that you wrote, which I thought was a really nice piece and I think is very important, one of the pieces to me that stood out was like hearing his experience of saying, yes, I do this now. I was a victim of gun violence, and now, I try to basically save people in one of the worst situations of their lives. But ultimately, like, the problem is not solved by great doctors, saving someone from a gun wound, right? It's preventing that in the first place, right? And it seems like that's, really, to me, it was an advocacy story of, I was a victim of this, and yes, I want to like deal with the crises, but I'd actually prefer if we could just eliminate the problem in the first place. I would like to hear more about like what resonates with you. You mentioned that like this is somewhat uncommon in the medical world to be rather like the opposite of conservative, basically, to be almost like very outspoken in this way. Like he's using his stature and his position to influence change. Can you talk a little bit more about whether that is something that is rare within the medical complex?
It's definitely rare, and historically it's been rare. I think it's beginning to change. But it's almost this idea that doctors often, they're in a treatment capacity, quite literally. So by the time something happens, right, it's often too late, right? By the time someone comes into Johns Hopkins emergency room, right, it's too late to have sometimes saved them because they're shot in the head and there's nothing you can do. So I think it was sort of his frustration, Dr. Saccharin's frustration that came out, that here I am operating on these patients and I can save some, and it's great when I can save them, right? But they're the ones that get away, and there's nothing I can do about that. And there's almost sensation that advocacy allows you that window into doing something. It's a common refrain in medicine nowadays that as a doctor you treat one patient at a time, and it's great and it's really important, but it's a limited scale. As a public health professional, as an advocate, you have the opportunity to treat populations and make a larger impact. And I think that's why you're starting to see some change in medicine, starting to see people who are doing some work in climate change, who are doing some work on gender-affirming care, who are doing some work in these various aspects where there is sort of this politicization of the issue. Abortion is another good example, right? But there's this real clear medical impetus why doctors should and need to be involved, right? Why they're often the ones bearing the consequences of sort of these political decisions, right? So they deserve to have a voice at the table. It's hard because you don't want doctors to start to think that we can do anything under the sun because everything is healthcare and whatnot. There's obviously extremes here, right? And there are people who might be better suited in some of these positions, certainly. But it's one of those things where I think there's room. A lot of these needs are urgent and expansive, and there's room for more people at the table.
Yeah, I want to go back to something because, you mentioned how his experience of, being a victim of gun violence and then deciding to basically make that, in many ways, like his life career, his profession, being somewhat rare, because I find that interesting. For me, just anecdotally, a lot of my interest in public health and even a lot of my friends who are pre-medical or med students, a lot of the motivation came from similar situations of, well, I have a rare illness or my family member has a rare illness, and it does to me seem like that is often an impetus, but you hit on something really important, right? Which is that at the end of the day, like, a physician can only provide so much. There's only so much sort of like quantity of care that can be done. And so it's harder to have an effect on the macro as an individual physician. And we have this conversation while you yourself are on this path to become a physician, right? Or to become a doctor. And so I'm curious how you reconcile that, as an ambitious person, the limitations, and is perhaps the reason that you're involved in writing to combat that in some ways.
Certainly. I mean, it's one of those things where you can almost understand why physicians have often stayed in their lane, have often focused on clinical care. It's what they know how to do well. It's what they've spent a lot of time and money training to do. And there's quite a large need for it, right? You want physicians who are working 7 days a week, right, treating patients, because there's a shortage of clinicians in this country, right? People can't get access to appointments. You want people working in these capacities. I think for me, though, it's sort of balancing that clinical need and desire with these larger policy questions and finding some way to use my clinical decision-making, my understanding of medicine to influence how we think about health policy, influence how we think about some of the most controversial issues of our time and how we're going to deal with those. For me, I write, as you suggested, because it's a way to expand my work beyond hospital walls, right? Because it's a way to reach out directly to policymakers, reach out directly to patients, and inform and convince and describe in a way that feels very hard to do if I was to sit in my clinic 5 days a week and do nothing but see patients. That's important, and I'm glad there are people that do that, and I will do that with a portion of my career. But finding ways to see my work in chapters and see my training as something foundational that I can riff off of almost, right? That as a physician, it means something different to be writing a article than it means to be as a master's student. Certainly, I come from a different background, a different perspective, a different kind of authority. And I think that's useful when coming to this idea of how do you persuade people, right, to join you? How do you persuade people to make the changes that you want to see in the world? And I think storytelling is a useful conduit for that. And being a physician is a useful place to do that from.
So this is a great segue because I'm super curious. Like, what was your initial motivation in getting involved in writing? Have you been writing from a young age and it's just always been something that's interested you? Or was there a specific time that you realized, like, okay, I see some potential here? Where did this start for you?
For me, writing was always a way to learn almost. I used to have a blog in high school, and I mean, there must have been only like 3 people who were reading it, one of whom was my mom. But it was this idea that, for me, it was like every other week I would pick a random topic. Like maybe it would be nanorobots in medicine one week, and maybe it would be multiple sclerosis the next. And then the week after, I took this online course, and I thought it was fascinating. Let me tell you about it. And it was a way for me to basically, how can I distill my thoughts into something that I can explain it to other people? What background reading do I need to do to make sure I'm explaining this correctly, right? And I found that it was just a tremendous way to learn about these different things. And it felt like a game, right? Every other week I'd choose something random to learn and I'd write 1,000 words about it. And there's something thrilling about it. I never thought of writing as something I'd actually do as a career or as sort of a serious hobby, right? This was a blog. It was just for fun. I think it translated a little bit in college when I started to write some editorials for medical journals. And it was one of those things where it was the right mentor, right time, right place. I had this idea, send it to her. She says, Simran, this is actually kind of good. We should submit this to the New England Journal of Medicine. And we submitted it, and then about a week later, they say, we want to publish this. And it's one of those things where you can't sort of script this in a movie even. It would be too absurd. But it gave me so much confidence that, hey, some people actually care what I have to say and what I have to write. And it can actually reach a lot of people. It can be, this piece was cited by the Presidential COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force, by the Dutch government on their advisory group of slavery. It had real international impact. And that was sort of this boost. And I want to continue writing. I wrote a lot for medical journals. The journalism aspect came later. That was sort of a function of taking some creative writing classes in my undergraduate and thinking, this is really cool. This is kind of writing that's completely foreign to me. It feels more exciting. It feels more fun. It feels like people actually want to read this rather than being forced to read it in a class. Can I do this? I took those 2 classes. I said, okay, I'm going to apply for all of these different internships, and I'm going to get an internship, and I'm going to practice this, and I'm going to get it. I didn't get a single internship. I had no journalism experience. I had no background. So I was like very much, woe is me, chicken and the egg. You need to have experience to get experience. I go to that same mentor who I worked with on the medical editorials, and I was telling her the situation. She's like, Simmer, why do you need an internship? Why can't you just do this on your own? And it was simple but profound, and I was like, well, I guess you're right. And I spent that summer freelancing. I must have sent over 500 cold emails that summer to basically any editor whose email I could get a hold of. And then eventually, slowly, one said yes, then I was able to use the one for the second and third, and it just spiraled into something that made me realize, well, I can actually do this work, and it is actually pretty fun and pretty great. So it was one of those full circle moments, coming from the blog to the journalism, both the form of writing, both the form of explaining about medicine and health. But one's finally starting to be read by people, which I think is exciting.
That's like such a sweet pull into this line of creation work, honestly. And I'm really interested within the context of medicine, like within the broader medical community. Do you feel like, let's just call it storytelling as a practice, is valued?
No, I don't. And I'll explain what I mean. I think it's becoming increasingly valued, but right now it's not seen as something that's valued by the academy. The academy values research papers, they value clinical trials, they value citations. And the idea is that storytelling, whether it's journalism, whether it's documentary making or whatnot, is something you can do in your own time. It's something that's nice if it brings some favor to the university, right, and our name by association. But it is not your main profession, and we will not promote you based on that, or we will not recognize those efforts formally, so to say, which I think makes it an interesting endeavor. One thing is you work in academic medicine, but then you're very content to stay as an assistant professor because you're not going to get promoted doing journalism, and you're okay with that, and that's fine. Or you sort of do this, right, alongside the research you do. You have these strands running in parallel, one to satisfy the academy, one to satisfy the country, or your sort of like itch, your storyteller's itch. I think it's something that we're beginning to see as increasingly valuable, especially post-COVID. I think you would imagine and hope that doctors would be good at conveying information, having to explain various things to patients every day in and day out. But it's a different beast when you're storytelling to a much larger audience, when you're storytelling to the nation. And I think there's an increasing appreciation for the need of these skills, and also the way that just storytelling as a whole can illuminate a lot of problems and drive forward some research priorities or policy priorities, right? That it is a tool in the arsenal, and doctors have a role to play. It's interesting because you see a lot of doctors who are memoirists, who at the end of their career write a memoir that this is my story, this is my life. You don't see a lot of doctors who are reporters. That is a much rarer breed, but I hope it changes, and I think it is changing a little bit. But I think it'll only change truly once if journalism and storytelling is accepted as a valuable form of academic practice.
I have to I don't want to be too much of a Debbie Downer today, but I have to wonder if quite literally there is just a simple logical constraint for any new physician, or for that matter, even someone prior to being a physician when they're in a fellowship or a residency and they're simply overworked. Yeah. And they just don't, like, there logistically isn't the time in a busy schedule to also be reporting, writing a story, doing public communication anyway. I mean, do you see limitations beyond that? This is where I'm like, is this just pessimistic? Is it simply, well, we need to have doctors working less so they could have one free time for lots of things, but moreover for important things like this, like we're saying, like to be able to have macro level influence, that takes time and it takes effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on, right? I mean, it's the similar causes behind burnout, and you can't tell the burned out physician, hey, you know what you should do? You should write, right? That would be great, right? I mean, or you should do this wellness session or whatnot. Those are not the solutions here. I think it's one of those things where often it has to come from people themselves, right? Who make time for it, carve time out for it, right? I mean, because I have friends who are in their residency and still continuing to write, still continuing to find time. It's not easy. It's not by any stretch of the imagination. But it's something they prioritize because They either love it so much or they see it's very important or some combination of those two. Honestly, I think it's one of those things where I think there are benefits to writing, and there's this field of narrative medicine that sees writing as a way to even process difficult patient encounters and think through them and share them with people, and that is a just form of healing and form of sort of addressing some of these burnout issues. So I think there can be a role, but it's one of those things where it's almost like being willing to accept that not everyone is going to write, and that's okay. But that people are going to come to medicine with their different forms of impact, different forms of making an different influence, right? I mean, you'll have some people who will add climate change to their medical school curriculum, right? That's very interesting. It's important. Right? There's some people who will write and tell stories. There are some people that will be in the lab and be creating new therapeutics. All of these are valuable, and I think perhaps if there was greater appreciation of sort of the diverse talents and the diverse ways of making an impact, that in turn would create greater space for people to experiment with their more creative side, to write without feeling that they need to first do the research, right? They need to first be in the lab and run a lab instead of potentially having more flexibility in choosing what they want to do instead of what they need to do.
I want to, now that we were talking about some of the limitations of, maybe how not having enough physicians who are also engaged in like sharing their stories, sharing their experiences, having this influence. A case study, you might be familiar with this, because I'm curious your thoughts in terms of how storytelling could actually be serving some of the limitations, could actually be fixing some of the limitations in the current healthcare system. Are you familiar with the condition clubfoot?
A little bit, not so much. So please enlighten me.
So this is a relatively high occurrence rate. We'll just call congenital birth defects, in which a child is born with what are called club feet, which is essentially the feet have, rather than forming sort of normally, are reversed inwards and twisted posteriorly. And so relatively high incidence rate. Don't fact check me on this. I can pull up tabs. I would say a bit more common than you would think. Let's say maybe a couple in 1,000 children will be born with this worldwide. And so, and it's been that way for a relatively long time. And so we've got the past century of treating this, we've seen a massive shift in what the standard of care is. And so 100 years ago, the standard of care, if it was even there, was you basically just live with it. As the child is born, feet remain that way, and it's very painful, and it creates a lot of difficulty. You can't wear shoes. There's all sorts of issues with this malformation. A couple decades in, we realized you could perform pretty risky and complicated surgeries on the newborn to basically reshape the feet. Right. This was, it's a series of surgeries, meaning that it is prohibitively expensive, it's risky, you're performing surgeries on, newborn children, which is problematic. Right. But in some cases, it could work. If the resources were there, if the surgery went well, the recovery worked out, this was the standard of care up until, I believe it was the 1960s, when a doctor named Dr. Ponseti, I think he was in Idaho, who is a pediatric physician. Gosh, there's so much fact-checking that needs to happen here. I think most of these facts are correct. But he had an interesting idea. He had this idea because he was seeing, these clubfoot babies and wondering, we do this risky surgery. It doesn't always work. It typically is multiple surgeries. Is it possible that there is a non-surgical intervention that we could attempt? And he basically came up with this method of multi-stage, gently bending the soft tissues while the baby was still fresh, right? Brand new. And then casting the foot in a slightly corrected position, waiting a few weeks, and repeating that process until ultimately the feet of the child were in, we would call a normal orientation. Sure. And what's really surprising about all of this is he started doing this, and it worked. It worked really well. Yeah. In fact, it had a much better success rate than the surgeries. Right. Of course, there's none of the risks or the costs involved in surgery. It's just physical manipulation, casting, and then time for the soft tissues to sort of reform in the original configuration. So that was the 1960s, right? It wasn't until about 2000, I would say the late 2000s, so maybe 2008, that this became the global standard of care. If you have a child now who has clubfoot, who's born with club feet, the Ponseti method is what is used everywhere in the United States and globally. But if we go back to 1960s, we're talking about almost a 50-year latency between this, what is now well known to be superior method in every way. It's far more feasible. It's easier to do. There's no risk involved in the way that there is with surgery. It's not prohibitively expensive, and it drastically improves the quality of life of the patient. But there was a 50-year delay between development, implementation in his clinic in Idaho, or wherever in the Midwest. We'll pretend it was Idaho for the sake of this podcast. And widespread adoption. And so, this is something that, in my storytelling work, I think about a lot is like, what are the barriers between when a great idea or an important discovery occurs and the adoption within society? So from your landscape, both invested, academically in medicine, as well as, medical journalism, tell me what your take is on this situation, and where maybe when another Ponseti comes along, what role might storytelling play in speeding this process up? 50 years, that's nearly a lifetime.
Unfortunately, this is fairly common in medicine, this idea of progress and advancements taking sometimes up to 50 years, sometimes longer. I think we're seeing something very similar with even insulin prices, where advocates have long made the case that insulin prices are too high, that people are rationing doses, and they're literally dying because of the prices. But it's been very, very hard to get policy to actually cap the prices. And only recently was it capped at $35 for the Medicare population. But even then, there was a vote this week or last week in the Senate where they said, we're not going to expand this to the general public. We're going to only keep this for Medicare. That might have been too far. We dare not expand this further. So, there's something, I think, gratifying in one sense that, yes, through advocacy, this was able to be done, right? And it took a lot of time and effort, but at least we got it done. But also this frustration, like, how could this have been any faster? What could have made this happen faster, both in your story and the insulin price cap one? For me, I think I see it in two ways. One is that I think a lot of our systems exist in silos, right? A lot of our researchers are really good at researching and putting out good data into journals, but then nobody ever reads that journal. They die on the dusty old shelf, or they die in the hands of the couple hundred or 1,000 people who read it. Then you have a lot of good journalists, right, who are able to tell these stories, and they're great. But sometimes they're disconnected from the research. Sometimes they're not even asking the most important questions or telling the most important stories. They're telling something like, and forgive me if you love pickleball, but they're telling the story of what is the sound that pickleballs make, right? So it's not always, and even if it is explicitly science journalism, it's not always the most important questions or the most important controversies, and they're perhaps the more convenient ones, or more clickbaity ones. Then you have a lot of good policymakers who, some of them I genuinely want to do good, some of them I hope so. But it's almost this question about, like, what is the highest yield things? Where's the data? What is the most evidence-based things and reforms we can do? What are the most utilitarian ones we can do? And essentially, my theory of the world and perhaps theory of change is that a lot of these camps are not talking with one another and not working so hand in hand. And for me in my career, I want to be the person that I'll never be the expert researcher. I'll never be the expert journalist or the expert policymaker. But if I have enough proficiency and background in each of them to be able to be the best person who can bridge the research to the journalism to policy, to create this continuum of change where you sort of speed run the situation. There's a good example in the ALS world. There's one advocate who has made enormous advances in this world. He started off as, I believe, an Obama staffer, and he developed ALS either while Barack Obama was in the White House or maybe shortly thereafter. And they were able to wrangle together this enormous funding bill through Congress in like record time, essentially. Less than a decade, probably maybe even like 5 years or so, for a condition that is fairly rare, to be fair. And the reason they were able to do it is he had such deep connections and understanding of the policy landscape, right? Of the people in the Senate and the House. He knew the power of his own story and how to share that. He and his wife were working hand in hand in how do we do this alongside the scientists? How do we identify where's their pressure points? What do they need to find a cure? What do they need to make substantial progress on this disease? So what he and his partner, what they were able to do was something remarkable because they understood the continuum and they understood really well and they could play the levers off each other. So I think that's sort of like, if we want to make change, right, you can wait for this, like the right person to come, or you can try to become that person yourself.
Wow, what a philosophical and poetic ending to that. So I feel like sort of what you're getting at here is, if we want to be able to advance society, or folks like yourself, because I think we have similar interests in this way, right? Of, well, we could go into an area of specialty, but then we're limited into the area of specialty, and we may fall prey to the siloism that occurs there. Or we could not specialize, right? We could be more generalist. And it sounds like what you're saying is like the idea of a Renaissance person is the type of person that advances things fastest, right? Because they understand enough about any of their given disciplines to be able to see the connection points and save us the 50 years that it would take, and instead do it in 5 or even less, which that was kind of a redundant statement, right? All you're going to have to say is yes.
No, but it is something where I feel that you're right. I mean, it is like, it takes sort of someone who can understand the intersections, but I think there's also a lot of ways to not do this well. I think it's one of the critiques you see of interdisciplinary work, that you're almost this like a jack of all trades, master of none, and you don't make a lot of impact. And I think it's one of those things where it takes a very hyper focus on what is the arrow that I'm going to be working towards, right? Because I think you can also be in a situation where your interdisciplinary is in a circle, right? It's just you're going round and round and isn't going anywhere, right? It's interesting and academic, but I think for me it's like, how does each build off the other? How can I propel that forward? And don't get me wrong, I don't think that I will be doing all of these 3 things at a high level to begin with. I see actually doing all these 3 things later in my life. And I see sort of this next phase as each a way to train myself in the different ways, right? That maybe at one point I'll be working in Washington, D.C., on the Hill, or in the White House, right? That'll be very explicitly training to understand how to understand the levers of policy, how to understand the levers of power. The journalism that I've been doing over the past 2.5 years and have continued to do is very much to understand, how do I leverage the power of storytelling? How do I leverage the power of the media to inform people and make this a voting issue almost, right? That people care enough about these issues, and it's so emotive that legislators feel the pressure. So, I mean, for me, it's about, I don't want to be that jack of all trades, master of none. I want to train very deeply in each of them, right? And be able to have a very clear vision of how they each fit in, right? That they're not just, I'm not studying music just because I like it and it's interesting, right? Each of these, I'm thinking in a very realpolitik, very pragmatic sense, that each of this builds to what I want to do in my life and sort of the change I want to make. They're all instrumental.
Very intentional way to live. For folks who might be following in your footsteps, may do this type of journalism or want to, I would love to just shift into like, can you give some like real practical advice? Like, hey, I have a great story. I'm trying to pitch it. Give us some practical advice to get someone's work out.
Yeah, the most nuts and bolts advice I can give here is you just have to start sending emails. You just have to send them cold. Don't be embarrassed, right? Write a pitch and send them to editors, right? And if the editors don't respond, don't take it personally. When I was starting off, nobody responded to me because my pitches were so bad and their times is so valuable that they just didn't think it was even worth it to respond. But even that is feedback. Even that is a good reminder that I need to hone my work. I need to get this better. It's one of the beautiful things about the storytelling I do, journalism, where there is quite literally no barriers to entry. I had never done journalism, I had never studied journalism, but I was able to publish in Smithsonian Magazine and Washington Post and Time in The Atlantic my first summer of doing it. It's a rare thing, and I don't want to set anyone's expectations really high, but it's one of those things where editors' emails are public. You have an interesting idea, you can interview people and you can be a journalist, right? I think one of the first tip is just start doing it, right? There's like no need to be ashamed or nervous. Just like, what's the worst they can do, right? You're not writing before, you won't write after if they say no, right? It's no difference per se. I think the second thing is how, like, very pragmatic, like, how do you know how to write a good pitch? There are a lot of good resources out there. The Open Notebook has a lot of pitches online and available. I mean, pitches, for those who aren't familiar, are these like 200, maybe 300 word ideas that you put into an email. You try to make it as compelling as possible. You're essentially auditioning for this role as a writer, showing them how good of a writer you are, right? Even in your pitch. And you try to convince them to take a chance, right? And it's usually wise to start at lower profile outlets first, because they're willing to give a chance to first timers in a way that the national outlets, they want to see you have a little bit of a track record, you have a little bit of other clips, as they're called, or other stories. So I think one of the things is start low, keep sending emails, and then lean on sort of your sources. Like, reach out to people, ask to talk with them. People are generally flattered to be interviewed by a journalist, even if you're just getting started. And ask them what they think is interesting. Ask them what they think people misunderstand, right? People often ask me, where do I get my ideas, right? I get it from people. I get it from other stories I read, and I find that they've mentioned this side note here, but it's actually kind of fascinating and could be its own article. Be inspired by the things around you is sort of, I guess, the third piece I would offer.
I want to challenge a little bit just that first piece of advice of, you send a bunch of cold emails. Let's say you send 200 emails to editors. You've never pitched before, and you don't know if your pitch is good, and no one responds. In that situation, what is the advice, right? Is it ask those editors, hey, I know you didn't respond. Can you give me advice? Were you ever in a situation like this where you then said, well, let me actually go to someone who I know is good at writing, or at least good at critiquing, to develop those pitches, as opposed to just sending them into a black box and never hearing back?
Oh, definitely. And it's one of those things where I feel like you want to lean on whatever help you can get. So I talked to professors at my college, got some of their advice. I asked them to sometimes review pitches that I really cared about or were having some trouble. Occasionally, I'd ask the editors themselves, right, if they did respond with maybe one word no, like, could you elaborate? And also, obviously, you should always follow up, because an editor who didn't respond might also be an editor who didn't see your email. But it's one of those things where I think you're right. It can be dispiriting, and I think for me, the way I got over that despairing nature is just sending more emails, right, or like trying again and figuring that, yeah, well, this pitch must not be good. Like, there have been pitches I've had that are literally in graveyard, that no matter how many emails I've sent, nobody's taking them up. And for me, they're obviously heartbreaking, because I spent a lot of time working on the pitch, but also a good reminder that, okay, I'm sort of creating this mental model for myself. This is something that nobody cares about or responds to, right?
Sure.
And I can sort of hypothesize in my brain why they are, or sometimes the kindred editor will tell you, right? And that can be helpful too. One of the other things is just knowing each newspaper and magazine style, right? The reason they might not be taking your pitch is because, well, frankly, they don't do any of those stories ever, right? And if you actually read their magazine or newspaper, you would know that. So it is partly just being a little bit in touch with what's going on, scheduling coffee chats, right? If maybe there are some people like in your community, maybe who are alumni from your undergraduate institution, that you can reach out to and just ask them yourself. I lean on that, right? Lean on whatever resources you have. There's also plenty online, which is helpful.
Right now you're a student, and you are also a journalist. You are also a writer. With these stories that you're independently pitching, are you being paid by the outlets when you create these stories?
I am. So because journalism is, of course, a job. Freelance journalism is a job. I do get paid, and it ranges. I mean, when you're getting started, you don't get paid a lot. You often get paid below the standard rate, because you're risky and they don't know what it's like to work with you. Nowadays, I probably get paid usually $1, sometimes $1.25 per word, which is lovely and it's nice. It's very difficult to live off of, and I think that's a big issue in freelance journalism. I'm very fortunate where I'm doing this as a part-time job, in part because I really enjoy it. So it is just nice way to pay off my loans and a way to really just earn a little bit of spending money. But I don't do it necessarily for the money, and I'm in a very privileged position to be able to say that. But it's nice, right? I mean, that it's something I care about that I get paid for, so it works out very nicely for me.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important, like with this show, one of the things I want to do is just like lift the veil of like what is the practical for folks who want to do this type of storytelling professionally. You have to know like the nuts and bolts. I mean, the documentary world is also pretty similar. Like am a uniquely privileged filmmaker, at least in that form of my job, just because most people who produce documentaries are not earning enough that is their sole thing. This is a part-time job, or, I am a professor and on the side I do this, but it's few and far between. And I do feel like it's important for us to talk about that, because personally, I feel like that is problematic. I feel like it is problematic that we lack the resources for full-time writers to be, a reliable profession. To just something we have to challenge these power structures, because if we don't talk about it, they just get worse. Tell me about a real failure in your life as a writer. This could be a failure where there is no redeeming outcome per se, in terms of but I figured it out. Put us in, your perspective when something just really did not go your way. Maybe you learned something from it. Hopefully you learned something from it. What's something that was just a real challenge for you that you faced as a writer?
Yeah, I'll tell you something I'm going through right now. This summer, I was very fortunate to travel across the world and do some reporting from countries as far as from Iceland to South Africa to Thailand. And I got some incredible stories, met some incredible people, came home, and I was like, okay, I'm going to write them up. I'm going to sell them to the outlets, right? They're just so compelling and so interesting. Everyone's going to be interested in it. And I have had the world's hardest time, the hardest time I've ever had pitching these stories, right? This is even harder than when I was first getting started, right, and didn't know what I was doing. Part of the challenge is that global health stories don't really sell well. They're not very well read, right? And it has been frustrating to me, and because I want to tell these stories, I've invested a considerable amount of my own resources trying to tell them, and I think they're important. But it's almost this sense that it's not so. We'd rather, do those pickleball stories. We'd rather do this or that. Do you have sort of these other wellness-related stories? Because they do really well. And it's one of those things where, it's an unfortunate state of the profession, right? And it's unfortunate, having to find stories that, just will click well instead of ones that are deeply reported and actually mean a lot. But I think it's also one of the things that makes you, I guess, be creative. And how I've tried to think about it is that, well, if people are not going to be interested in, for example, lung cancer in South Africa, how do I link that to things that people are interested in? Or how do I link it to deeper concepts, deeper issues that are a little bit more global, that are a little bit more universal? So for me, it's been enormously frustrating and I think heartbreaking. I've made it all this way. I've won all these prestigious awards, but I still can't sell these stories. But also just forcing me to be a little bit more innovative and, I guess in many cases, right, frame the story. What can we learn from this country here in the U.S.? Basically orient the U.S. reader back into the narrative very explicitly. And it feels sometimes uncomfortable to be doing it. Sometimes it's artificial. But I think it's also, it's also sometimes a good framing, right? That rather than the idea that knowledge flows from the West to the world, right? How can we flip that on its head and tell these stories in the way that we have a lot to learn from other countries and how they're doing things?
Well, one, I appreciate that you're giving a problem you're currently dealing with, because I think that can be harder to share that level of vulnerability. But I feel like what I'm hearing is, you have a collection of great stories, but the manner in which you tend to tell these stories with these news outlets, it's not fitting into basically what they want. It's not fitting out into their market or their specific ideals at this time. And I think this is a common issue with storytellers, right? Well, if the outlets aren't buying it, if the distributors are not buying it, it becomes much harder because you're trying to pitch to a market as opposed to just, these are great stories in and of themselves, you should share them. Where are you feeling, you just said you're having a really hard time. You're having the hardest time perhaps even in your career as a writer. What are you doing right now? What is your problem solving tactic to move forward through this?
And I think part of it is finding ways to reorient the stories. I think part of it is just going back to that resilience I had initially, and perhaps it's false optimism, but saying that these stories will get published, they will get told, right? I just have to give myself enough places at bat, right? And I have to sort of be as convincing as possible, as persuasive as possible to get these stories in. Right? I'll give you hard numbers to talk about this, right? I came out of the summer with 12 stories, and I expected by the end of the year, all of them will be published, right? I'll have about 5 to 6 months. It'll be plenty, right? All of them will be published. I have published 3, sold 4, right? So the fourth one I'm working on right now. So it's way beyond my expectations, not because I haven't sent them in and sold ideas, but it's just nobody's biting. So I think it is one of those things. Maybe I need to give myself a longer time horizon, be more patient, right? Be a little bit more creative. But I think it's one of those things where if they're so important to me, and I'm privileged to have the time and space to let them sit on the vine a little bit longer, then I'll let them sit and I will continue pushing.
I'm like reconciling this with I've been in similar situations with stories or with films. In fact, one of the practical things that I've had to do if I have a story that I'm convinced is great and is going to help people and it just needs to get out there, one of the practical limitations is just like, okay, allow that to, as you said, sit on the vine, right, and have another or two other projects that maybe are more appropriate for the time. And by the time that you finish one of those, you come back to the back burner and you say, okay, this pot's ready. Let me actually dish it out because people are ready to ingest it. Or I think you're being very practical and just, well, that's all nice and good, and sure, I can wait, but also maybe I can just reorient. Maybe I can adjust my approach. I do think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes that just doesn't happen. Sometimes the market's never going to be ready for it, and the traditional outlets of how we get the story out are never going to be ready for it. I mean, true innovation, right, like true novelty in ideas often are fully rejected by the institutions that be. Right. And so I'll be curious to follow up maybe in a couple of months to see like, all right, are you just going to go rogue, just go with your Substack, just release it to your own audience, which might be a good thought. I think this is great. I have one last little piece that I want to get to where I'm actually going to pitch an idea to you, a collaborative idea, and I want to hear what you think about this because I think your role as a journalist, particularly in the medical world, well, one, there's just a lot of common interest that we have, but there's a technology that I've talked to you a little bit about, really near and dear to my heart because it's the thing that's helped me with my back issue to have basically my whole quality of life return, which is fantastic. It saved me a horrible surgery. But I want to go a little bit further on it because I think what I've done in learning about this, and this is extracorporeal shockwave as a reminder, really, really interesting field of medicine. It's technically falling under the umbrella of regenerative medicine. And what I have realized, because I produce documentaries, that's my form of storytelling and public speaking, but there's not a lot of good writing on this field. In fact, there's also not even a lot of good video work on just explaining what this is. So I'm going to give you a really simple overview because I think this is a really compelling technology, not because of its implications for orthopedics. I think that's great. It's a small facet of how it's currently being used. What do you know about extracorporeal shockwave therapy?
I know literally nothing.
Okay, great. Are you familiar with the typical treatment for a kidney stone?
Is it using ultrasound waves to break it up?
Essentially, yes. So it's called lithotripsy, but it's basically using sound waves at pretty high frequency, high energy sound waves to slowly break apart a big mineral deposit into small mineral deposits, and then they can pass it through their body. So lithotripsy it's basically sound waves. This was the predecessor to what is now called shockwave. So the only real difference was this technology, I believe, is early 80s is when it started to become implemented for patients who had kidney stones or mineral deposits. It was sort of accidentally discovered later on in a medical research lab that at lower energy levels, at lower frequencies, these same sound waves, when propagated, can actually stimulate osteoclastic and osteoblastic involvement. Going further, we learned that there are lots of different cellular recruitments that can occur at different frequencies in different regions of the body. And so it's only since the late 90s, early 2000s that we realized, okay, not only can we break up big clumps of minerals, but at smaller frequencies, we can do a lot of really interesting things for connective tissue, for skeletal, for bone and muscular structure. We can engage connective tissue reformation. We can engage basically collagen restructuring, which, as you probably know, any sort of joint injury, connective tissue damage, it tends to be very slow to heal, right? Because they are generally avascular. Joints just take a really long time to heal. Basically, what we do is we tell people to use those joints using physical therapy. They have trained experts who walk them through the types of exercises, and it takes a long time. Shockwave is now becoming increasingly popular in the field of sports medicine within Western medicine very, very recently. And it's essentially, it's finding its way into like helping patients through physical therapists. It's still very slow to be adopted by just like a GP, for instance, or even orthopedic surgeons. I know I work with a lot of them. But where I think this is also a really fascinating technology is as just kind of, the scientific method of just hypothesis and experimentation has gone on, we've learned that at even lower energy levels, at even lower frequencies, the way in which it can impact the cardiovascular system is really fascinating, because at very, very low levels, it appears to stimulate a number of growth factors that can either help basically a plaqued artery or vein heal, actually deteriorate some of that wear, but also it stimulates growth factors such as VEGF, which is vascular endothelial growth factor, so encouraging the production of new blood vessels. So what's crazy about that, this is just one new avenue, and I say new, it's like 15 years of research that's going on now. There's an incredibly interesting study, I believe it was a Polish group, where they had patients undergoing heart surgery, and this is like an open heart surgery, where they figured out this crazy protocol of, okay, we know that shockwave at very specific frequencies can help with basically growing new blood vessels or healing damaged blood vessels. And so they created, it's so complicated how they did this, but they had a number of patients who were all going through the surgery, some of which also, while they had access to the heart, they performed shockwave on these patients, did the surgery, closed everything up, and they saw noticeable improvements in those patients who had both the surgery and the shockwave, which is just fascinating to me if you think about it, because we are just using sound to stimulate like an endogenous healing principle. I'm going to throw this last one out there, because to me, this is where there is a very promising story here. There is now very interesting implications and really promising data for neurodegenerative conditions using very low frequency shockwave on people's brains. It sounds insane, but I'll send you some papers if this sounds interesting, because it should. I mean, it blew me away. Treatment of Parkinson's patients to actually drastically ameliorate symptoms with nothing other than once a month for about 20, 30 minutes. They go into a clinic, they have very low energy shockwave performed on their brains, and we saw drastic reduction in the symptoms, meaning huge quality of life improvement. We didn't cure the Parkinson's, but as you probably know, with Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative conditions, the quality of life is terrible, and the treatment options are incredibly limited. So anything that could get us closer to better quality of life, sort of normalcy pre-Parkinson's, is really interesting and promising, and there's a whole new umbrella of Alzheimer's treatment with this. And so, and I've only learned about this literally because I was a patient for its orthopedic implications. So I'm just sharing sort of my perspective as someone who also works in medical storytelling. With my affiliation at UNC, I'm very interested in medical issues and medical research, but also from like a patient perspective, I see so much potential for this modality of treatment. And yet obviously the crux of any medical innovation in the United States is ultimately it is profit that is going to be one of our major inhibitors in implementation, right? Is if there's a new technology that threatens the existing profit structures for treatments, it's going to be slow to be adopted, right? Because whatever the current treatment is now being threatened, right? And so there's this, a technology we thought was just good for kidney stones, and now it's like, well, actually it has implications for folks with heart failure, folks who have major orthopedic injuries that will not heal, folks that have neurodegenerative conditions that you could potentially keep them at bay. That's my pitch, is I think it's a very, very fascinating realm of medicine, and there's really a lack of reporting in the United States. There's a lot of reporting and actually implementation in Europe. That is where most of the bodies of research are coming out of. That's where most of the companies that produce these devices are based out of. We're currently working on a research proposal for them to fund, as well as a documentary to get this more implemented, at the minimum, in more research within the U.S. for neurodegenerative conditions, because I think that's huge, right? This is such an important issue for folks as they reach later years of life with very limited options. But even in the short term, making this the standard of care for sports medicine as an athlete, I feel has enormous potential. That's my pitch. Shockwave's cool. I do encourage maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole between your classes.
No, definitely. I think it's fascinating, and the fact that it's underreported is always sort of it's tragic, but also attractive as a story, right? That here is a story that people haven't told before. It's fresh, it's new. I think the big challenge, of course, is that, right? I mean, is like editors will want to know, like, how established is this therapy, right? Is there the evidence to show this works? And I think based on what you're saying, it seems like that condition is met. But yeah, it's more, I think it is also, there's conflict there also too, right? I mean, it is sort of this, the established profit structures that you were sort of highlighting, right? The fact that it might be difficult to fund clinical trials, right? To show that these things work, because presumably you don't have a big pharma company backing this, or it might be difficult to commercialize. So I think there's something quite attractive about the idea there, and just the fact that there's a compelling, like, I mean, even the way you framed it, like this started for kidney stones, now we're finding it works for all these things. It feels very much like an Ozempic-like pitch, like, oh, it started for diabetes, but then now we're finding it works for all these things, right? So I think there's sort of that, nothing's a panacea, but there is sort of this attraction to the panacea type stories, right? We started for one thing and then it's having all these different effects, and even the idea that it's like sound waves or shock waves is kind of like compelling to an editor, because it's something that is clickbaity is not the right word, but it is compelling to the reader, right? Like, oh, what is this story about shock waves that are just like the new medical great innovation in medicine? So no, I think it's fascinating, and I would definitely be curious to pursuing it further.
I feel like, and I don't, this is not my bread and butter for storytelling, but if I were to pitch like a written version of this, because that is my proposal, I think we should revisit this if you have time in your busy schedule, to co-author something I think would be interesting, is I know for a fact that among top athletes in the US, this is like the first line of treatment. Physical therapists are incorporating shockwave because it's known to cut the recovery periods down to fractions of their original, right? And it makes sense on sort of a fundamental level if it's like, okay, if you can stimulate endogenous growth factors to be produced at a higher level for an injury area and you do physical therapy, of course you're going to get a faster result. You're just speeding up normal bodily processes. So in terms of like getting a sexy story out there, I think finding an elite athlete who's gone through this and talking about their experience is maybe a good way to start it. I don't know. Something we should revisit. It's a genuine thing. I'm not just saying this off the cuff. Let's work on a paper together. But now, unless you have any further thoughts about that, I would love to give you an opportunity to... The segment is how we're going to end every episode, which is tell me something about the future that gives you hope, that brings you joy, that fills you with optimism.
I'll start with the pessimism, because why not? It's a not so great landscape in science journalism. Lots of people being laid off, lots of newspapers shuttering or at least reducing their science journalism scope. What gives me hope is that I think the pandemic really highlighted the importance of this work and the need to find innovative ways to do it and to fund it. And just the fact that there is this growing attention about the importance of science communication, about the importance of training people who can speak well to the public, right? There's this sort of growing appreciation for that as a skill set, even though it's not so well accepted in the academy. Even there, it's starting to increase. So I think for me, what gives me growing hope is you're seeing a lot of sort of practitioners of science who are starting to learn and lean into how can I be a science writer, how can I be a science storyteller better. And that skill set, regardless of whether the media landscape, regardless of whether there are outlets that publish this as regularly or whether there's some consolidation or reduction, that skill set spreading is something that gives me hope. Because I think that skill set is how we talk to our crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, how we talk to people on the streets, how we tell them about the things we care about and convince people about the things that are important in science and medicine. It's something that's naturally interesting. People are scared of science, but there is some natural intrigue. There's some natural curiosity there. So how do you bridge that? How do you make it so that this is not so imposing, not so scary, and people can actually look at this as something engaging? And I think we're getting better at that as a society.
Awesome. Okay. Well, it's been wonderful. This is really good. I appreciate you being on as part of the first season.
That brings this story to a close. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we would love your input. If you have an idea, like a future guest or a new segment, send us a message, podcast@etherealfilms.org, or you can leave us a comment on the Substack. The show is made to help other creatives just like myself, so if you want to support us, tell another friend to start listening. It really makes a difference. Real Perspective is produced in Hillsborough, North Carolina at Ethereal Films. Episodes are co-produced by Ava Richardson-Dodd, and Sammy Bauer is our head of cat wrangling. I'm Eli, and that was A Real Perspective.